knows what Prop 207 is? Do you know what that is, sir?
I'm hoping I do.
Will you come up here and talk to us about it?
Steve, thanks so much to you and to the Highway 69 Republican Club for inviting me out tonight to do a presentation on Prop 207. Before I get into that, though, I just want to give another shout out to Donna Tanzi. Donna, you may not know this, but in 2015, I was the co-chair along with Malcolm Barrett of the Finance Committee for Yavgop, and we came nowhere close to raising the kind of money to do this. So this is the first time I think in the history of Yavgop this has been done, and it is really a remarkable achievement. $8,000 is not an insignificant amount of money. So congratulations, you've done a tremendous job. So for those of you who don't know, and I don't think that's probably too many people in this room, my name is David Stringer, and I'm a local attorney. I've been involved in some political work here in Yavapai County for the last few years. I was in the House of Representatives, and while I was in the House of Representatives, I was on the Judiciary Committee, and we entertained legislation, decriminalization legislation. I actually founded a little organization, a study group in the House of Representatives. It was a bipartisan study group on criminal justice reform. And we kept that going for about a year and a half, drafted a number of bills that never really saw the light of day. They got drafted, they got submitted. They didn't always get committee hearings and didn't really go anywhere. But I did work on criminal justice reform. That was my signature issue in the legislature, and it got me in a lot of trouble. So I want to talk on 207 because it was just in 2016, the year I first ran for office, that there was another proposition, the predecessor of 207, and that was 205. And that was another decriminalization, or I should say legalization of marijuana, voter initiative. The legislature, which creates our criminal code, they pass the laws. They are the ones that decide whether or not a drug or a substance is going to be against the law. They are the ones that many years ago that decided that the possession of marijuana would be a felony in the state of Arizona. Arizona is now the only state that's never been changed. We are the only state that continues to prosecute the simple possession of marijuana, even the smallest amount, as a felony. So there have been many efforts over the years to lower that, to change the penalty, to defelonize it. It has not been successful. And that's really what has driven the voter initiative. It's been the frustration of a lot of people who don't think marijuana should be a felony or don't think marijuana should be against the law. The legislature has not been responsive, and so the voters have taken it into their own hands. Before I really get into this, though, I want to emphasize that I'm not here as an advocate. I have been associated with criminal justice reform, but in 2016, I did not endorse Prop 205, which would have legalized marijuana in the state of Arizona. I thought there were too many problems with that voter initiative. I support the concept of defelonizing and maybe even decriminalizing small amounts of marijuana, but I did not endorse Prop 205, and I'm not here tonight to endorse Proposition 207. My job here tonight is simply to sort of give you a feeling of what does this bill really entail, and what is some of the history. So before we get into the details of the bill, I want to give you a little context about marijuana in the United States today. There are now 11 states in the United States, plus the District of Columbia. These are jurisdictions that have completely legalized the possession of small amounts of marijuana for personal use, what is commonly referred to as recreational marijuana. 11 states plus the District of Columbia, and I'll name them for you: Alaska, California, Colorado, Illinois, Maine, Massachusetts, Michigan, Nevada, Oregon, Vermont, Washington State, and Washington, D.C. So think about that list for a minute. California, Nevada, Colorado, all bordering the state of Arizona. So in addition to these 11 states that have legalized this possession of marijuana, recreational marijuana, there's about 16 other states that have decriminalized it. Now there's an important distinction between complete legalization and decriminalization. The states, the 16 or so states that have decriminalized, they've done it in many different ways, but the common denominator of all of the decriminalization states is that they have removed the criminal penalty, at least for first offenders, for small amounts of marijuana. They've left the criminalization statute on the books, but they have found a way that for first offenders, for small amounts of personal of possession of marijuana for personal use, they have made it a civil penalty. But they have retained the concept that marijuana is not a good thing and it shouldn't be. It's still against the law.
What a small amount is?
Everybody defines it differently, and I'm going to take questions at the end. But in Arizona, this proposal is an ounce or less. My proposal in the legislature was actually, I think it was 3 grams. So different jurisdictions define it differently, but it's typically a relatively small amount of marijuana. So the point I want to make is that among those 16 states that have decriminalized marijuana, at least for first offenders, is New Mexico. So that gives us 4 states bordering the state of Arizona where marijuana is not prosecuted as a crime at least for the simple possession of small amounts. So I think that's a significant circumstance, and I think it's really something that should give us some thought. You know, our neighbors in California, in Nevada, in Colorado, in New Mexico, when they're in their own states, they're not breaking the law when they smoke a little bit of pot. But if they cross the border into Arizona, they become felons, not just misdemeanors, not just a minor crime, but a felony. And that's a pretty dramatic consequence. So the first state to legalize marijuana, the first 2 states actually, they did it the same year, was Colorado and Washington State, and that was in 2012. Nevada legalized marijuana in 2016, and California just legalized it earlier this year in 2020. So there is clearly a trend across the country to decriminalize or to legalize marijuana. Over half of the U.S. population now lives in a jurisdiction where marijuana is either legal or it's been decriminalized for low-level first offenders. At the federal level, marijuana is still against the law. Nothing has changed. So in the Obama administration, I believe it was 2013, there was a policy change because California and other states were starting to decriminalize it. Medical marijuana was starting to pass. Arizona passed medical marijuana, but it's still a crime at the federal level. So Obama issued an executive order saying that they would not prosecute possession of marijuana in jurisdictions where they had passed medical marijuana or decriminalized in one way or another. And Trump has not changed that policy. That remains the policy today. The problem is it's not a law. It's just an executive order. That policy could be changed at any time. So it's sort of a gray area. In 2019, a decriminalization bill did pass the Democrat-controlled House of Representatives. It passed the Judiciary Committee in the House of Representatives. It never made it onto the floor. So that federal prohibition on possession of marijuana, it remains. In 2019, the Gallup organization did a poll and determined that about 12% of the U.S. population acknowledges using marijuana on at least an occasional basis, either a regular basis or an occasional basis. And just over half, about 51% of the U.S. population acknowledges having used marijuana at least sometime in their life. Those are pretty substantial numbers. Around the world, a number of countries have actually decriminalized or legalized marijuana. Uruguay was actually the first country in 2013. Peru has legalized marijuana. Canada has legalized marijuana in 2018. When you go to Canada, marijuana is completely legal. Finland, in Europe, Finland, Norway, Denmark, Switzerland, and a number of other smaller countries like Malta and so like that. Malta, they have also legalized possession of marijuana. So in general, Europe is more lenient towards marijuana than we are here in Arizona or in the United States generally. There are exceptions, but most of the European countries have a somewhat more lenient attitude. Some of you may remember the coffee shops in Amsterdam where you could buy marijuana legally, and that goes all the way back to the 1970s. In 2016, as I said, there was a Prop 205, which is similar, not a duplicate, but similar to the proposition that we're now looking at, but it failed to pass. It failed by less than 1.4%. So I think the number was 51.4% in favor and about 48.6% opposed. I hope those numbers work out. But it was a very narrow loss for the legalization of marijuana. It did pass in a couple of counties. One of those counties was Coconino. Coconino County actually went for the legalization of marijuana, along with Pima County, which is the home of Tucson. Probably has something to do with the universities that are located there. But Mojave County, very conservative, strongly Republican county to our west. The marijuana initiative failed in Mojave County by less than 20 votes. They almost passed it. Here in Yavapai County, it failed by over 20,000 votes. So it is not a popular thing in Yavapai County. The current ballot initiative is sponsored by an organization called Smart and Safe Arizona. That's the industry PAC for the marijuana industry. It garnered about 500,000 signatures. It has some common provisions with the 2005 initiative, but it's not a duplicate by any means. The biggest changes are in the area of how the dispensaries are to be authorized and regulated, and how the tax revenues are to be used. So let's look at the proposition itself. The text is fully set out in this booklet that I'm guessing most of you have received. This is the voter guide, the Arizona 2020 general election publicity pamphlet that is put out by our Secretary of State in Phoenix. And I'm guessing that most of you who are registered to vote, anybody who's registered to vote, should actually receive this guide. They published the full text of the bill. It runs about 20 pages, and it's just legalese. But fortunately, Legislative Council has done a nice analysis and summary, and the Congressional Budget Office, not the Congressional Budget Office, but our Budget Office has also done a physical note, and that's what I'm going to focus on tonight, the key provisions. The first thing you'll notice, I'm guessing that not many people are going to want to wade through 20 pages of the text of the bill, but right after the bill are the letters in support and in opposition. And I count about 10 letters in support. Former Governor Fife Symington is the biggest name, I think, that has come out in support of Prop 207. There are other industry representatives and people in the healthcare field who have also supported it. But in opposition to the bill, to the voter initiative, there are over 100 letters. Over 100 letters in opposition. Governor Ducey did a letter. House Speaker Bowers did a letter in opposition. Congresswoman Debbie Lesko did a letter in opposition. The head of the Arizona Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Glenn Hammer, did a letter in opposition. But when you look at those letters, I didn't read them all, I have to confess. I didn't read all 100 and some odd letters, about 102, 103 letters. But I did read a good sampling of them. And I kind of counted them up and see who was actually writing letters. And the thing that surprised me is that Yavapai County accounts for about a third of the letters, which is a remarkable number because Yavapai County has a population of about 240,000 people. That's about 3%, 3.4% or something of the state population, which is something over 7 million. So a jurisdiction with about 3.5% of the state population submitted a third of the letters in opposition to the ballot initiative. And you'll recognize, I'll give you some of the names. I'm not going to give them all to you, but I'll give you some of them. Superintendent Tim Carter, Superintendent of Education Tim Carter wrote a letter. Mary Lee Fowler, head of MatForce, wrote a letter in opposition. State Senator Steve Pierce wrote a letter in opposition. County Attorney Sheila Polk, of course, wrote a letter in opposition. Former RWAP Chair Susan Cohen wrote a letter in opposition. And former candidates for the State House, Dr. Ed Gogek and Jody Rooney, wrote a letter in opposition. Sylvia Allen wrote a letter in opposition. She's not in Yavapai County, but she wrote a letter in opposition, as did Representative Blackman, Nancy Bartow. A number of elected officials across the state wrote letters in opposition, but a third of the letters, actually a little bit more than a third of the letters in opposition to Prop 207 actually came out of Yavapai County. I don't know why that is. Do you? I don't know. We can speculate.
Well, there was quite a letter. There was an act they were trying to get.
Out of Yavapai County, yeah. It's just we're sort of outliers in opposition to 207. So I didn't read all the letters, but do I have a few more minutes here? Yeah. I didn't read all the letters, but there are some. I did read a sampling, and there are some themes that are repeated over and over again in these letters. The first one is that legalizing marijuana will increase use, especially among children and adolescents. And this will be detrimental, they argue, to their neurological development and academic success, and contribute to behavior problems. This is one of the tropes, one of the themes that runs through these letters. The proposal, of course, does not legalize marijuana for children and adolescents. The age limit is 25. Marijuana remains illegal for anybody under the age 21. Marijuana remains illegal for anybody under the age of 21. But the argument is that if marijuana becomes legal and more common, then it's going to be easier to get, and that will increase usage among adolescents and children. They argue that legalization will put more impaired drivers onto the highways, and that's probably true. That if more people are smoking pot, then there'll be more drivers on the street smoking pot, and that will make us less safe. The bill, though, actually does continue to criminalize driving while impaired, driving under the influence of marijuana. So the bill doesn't legalize driving while using marijuana, but the argument is if it becomes more common, more prevalent in our society, that people will be using it more when they're driving. They argue that legalization has not worked, that it has not worked where it's been tried, like they cite the problems in Colorado. And I'm not in a position to comment on those things one way or another, although I visit Colorado actually quite frequently, and I have not encountered any personal problems there. And the thing that I would note among the 11 states that have legalized marijuana, and the 16 or so states that have decriminalized it in some fashion, none of those states have gone back. None of those states have passed these legalization or liberalization bills, and then 2 or 3 years later, when they find out it's not working and creating a lot of problems, have repealed it. It's never been repealed anywhere where it's been passed. No country has repealed it anywhere where it's been passed. So that's one of the arguments they make, but there may be some very valid points there in terms of the problems that they've made. What are the problems? Well, they say that it will contribute to mental health problems, that it will contribute to school dropout rates and academic failure, that it'll contribute to the abuse of other drugs, that it will contribute to homelessness and the like. And I'm not here today to refute any of that. There may be some very legitimate arguments to be made along those lines. They say that legalization will not reduce the costs of law enforcement and will not reduce prison costs because so few people who use marijuana or get prosecuted for using marijuana actually end up going to jail. So these are some of the arguments that they're making against Prop 207. Now, my job is not here to refute them or to argue about them or to advocate them or poke holes in them. I'm just trying to set out, in case you don't have time to read all these 100 and some odd letters, those are the key arguments that they're making. So let's look then at the key provisions. What exactly does Prop 207 do? It would legalize the personal use of up to 1 ounce of marijuana for persons 21 years and older. They would be allowed to put 21 years and older. They'd be allowed to buy and use and possess up to an ounce of marijuana, and they would be allowed to have in their homes and to cultivate up to 6 marijuana plants. Right? And then they put a ceiling, so you don't have 5 adults living in a home and having 30 marijuana plants. They put a ceiling of 12 on that. So 2 adults living together could have up to 12 plants, but 3 adults living together couldn't have 18. So it's 1 ounce of marijuana and up to six plants. One of the most important provisions is that for those aged 21 and over, the penalties for possession would be reduced from a felony to a civil penalty for the first offense, to a petty offense for the second offense, and to a Class 1 misdemeanor for a third offense. A Class 1 misdemeanor, I believe, carries a fine of up to $2,500 and up to 6 months in jail. A petty offense, a first offense would be a civil penalty only, would not be a crime at all, and then a second offense would be a petty offense, and I believe a petty offense in Arizona carries up to 30 days in jail, something like that. The bill, the initiative, would also transfer $45 million that's currently in the medical marijuana account. When people buy medical marijuana, they pay a tax, and a portion of that tax goes into a special fund that is sort of earmarked for drug education and things of that like. It's never been used. The legislature has never been able to agree on how to spend that money, so it's many millions of dollars now. The voter initiative would transfer up to about $45 million to a fund for education and criminal justice, including drug treatment and the expungement of records. And that takes me to another one of the key provisions of this act. The voter initiative, if passed, would allow anybody who has been convicted of the personal possession of marijuana up to 2.5 ounces, not 1 ounce, but up to 2.5 ounces. If they've been convicted, they would be able to petition the court. Wouldn't be an automatic expungement. They would have to petition the court to have their record expunged. And this would effectively remove felony convictions for many thousands of Arizonans who over the last few decades have picked up felony convictions for the possession of marijuana. They'd be able to get those things expunged. But as I say, it would not be automatic. They would have to petition the court. The state's attorney would have the opportunity to object to it. So if they were gang members or for some reason didn't deserve the expungement, the judge would have the authority to deny it. But for most people who had a conviction for marijuana and hadn't gotten into any other kind of trouble, they'd probably be able to get that expungement. It would ban smoking. A lot of people are concerned, well, if we legalize marijuana, then people are going to be smoking it. They'll be walking down the sidewalk or going to the park and you could smell the marijuana. No, it bans the smoking of marijuana in public places. As I say, it also bans the use of or the possession or purchase of marijuana for anybody under the age of 21. So it does not legalize marijuana for minors or actually anybody under the age of 21. It bans operating a motor vehicle while under the influence of marijuana, and it bans the consumption of marijuana while driving. So you can't be in your car smoking a J. That would be a basis for a cop to stop you and to cite you. Some of the others here, I'll go fast. I listed 20 of them. I don't think we have time to go through all of them. I want to talk a little bit about the dispensaries, because that's been a big concern, because obviously selling marijuana is like selling candy to a lot of people. You can make a lot of money at these medical dispensaries. We have them now, the medical dispensaries, but pot dispensaries will be licensed. The pot will be tested. It'll be regulated by the state. And who gets a dispensary license? Great way to make a buck in a little time, isn't it, to be selling marijuana? So the initiative, I'll come to you in a minute, the initiative limits the dispensaries for the first 3 months or so to people who currently have medical marijuana dispensary licenses. And then after that, it's opened up to the general public, and the licenses, the dispensary licenses, will be determined on sort of a lottery basis. And there's a formula for determining how many marijuana dispensaries we can have. It's a ratio of 10 to 1 based on the number of licensed pharmacies, like CVS and things like that. So for every 10 licensed pharmacy in Arizona, the Department of Health Services would be able to issue a medical marijuana dispensary license. That's the formula, 10 to 1 based on pharmacies. The revenue, this is one of the strong selling points for the people who are promoting this. The marijuana, like anything else that's sold in the state of Arizona, would be subject to the sales tax of the jurisdiction wherever it was sold, the regular sales tax. But on top of that, there would be a 16% tax on marijuana. This is projected to raise $166 million from this 16% tax. $166 million when the dispensaries are fully implemented on an annual basis. $166 million annual revenue increase. And then the regular sales tax is projected to produce about $88 million. So you're talking about roughly $250 million a year of additional revenue to the state from the legalization of marijuana. Now these are projections, these are estimates, but they're made by credible people. They're made by the Joint Legislative Budget Committee in our state government. Local jurisdictions would not be able to pass more restrictive legislations. They could regulate things like the hours of operation and things like that, but local jurisdictions would not be able to override or to pass more restrictive laws than the initiative itself provides. So those are the key provisions. I will tell you I have a personal position on this. I think it's fair for you to know that. I am a supporter of criminal justice reform. I think it's a mistake for Arizona to be the only state in the union where the simple possession of marijuana is a felony. We normally think of a felony as a very serious crime with a lot of collateral consequences. What's the difference between a felony and a misdemeanor? Well, it's defined by statute. A felony typically carries more than a year in jail and is considered a more serious offense. A misdemeanor typically carries less than a year in jail. That's how it's defined these days. But in common law, a felony was considered a crime of moral turpitude and had a lot of collateral consequences like the forfeiture of property and land and things of that nature. Felons could not vote in common law, and that's still the case in Arizona. So there's a difference between a felony and a misdemeanor. A felony carries a lot of collateral consequences. Here in Arizona, you can't serve on a jury. You can't vote. There are many disqualifications in terms of employment. Licensing, can't be a lawyer, can't be a doctor, can't be a school teacher, can't be a lot of things when you have a felony record. And in Arizona, over the last few decades, we have stigmatized thousands and thousands of people with felony convictions simply for having gotten caught when they were 19, 20 years old or at some point with a small amount of marijuana. So I think that's a mistake. I think we're shooting ourselves in the foot. I think we are diminishing ourselves as a community. So I support the defelonization of marijuana. But I don't think I'm going to support this initiative, and I'll tell you why. The problem with initiatives like this is that they are protected. They are voter-protected initiatives under the Constitution of Arizona. And that means that once the voters pass an initiative like this, it's very, very difficult to change anything. So the whole concept, the whole program of decriminalizing and legalizing marijuana, it's still very new. The first state to do it was Colorado in 2012. That's 8 years ago. So we really don't have a lot of experience with defelonization or decriminalization of marijuana, and we're getting data. We're getting new data all the time. Many people argue that there are tremendous problems created by legalizing marijuana. So I think as the data comes in, we may want to refine our laws a little bit. So it's a terrible mistake, in my judgment, to have a voter initiative that is protected under the Arizona Constitution, and the only way the legislature can change it is with a 3/4 vote. It requires a 3/4 vote to override or change a voter-protected initiative, and the change has to be in furtherance of the purpose of the initiative. So it's a very, very restrictive kind of ability of the legislature to change anything that a voter initiative does. So from that standpoint, I think it's bad public policy, and I don't think we should do it. I think we should do it, but not through a voter initiative. I think it should be done by the legislature. The reason marijuana is illegal in Arizona is because the legislature made it illegal, like all the crimes in our criminal code. The legislature does that. And the remedy should also come from the legislature. That's my judgment of the matter. So I thought you were entitled to hear my opinion. I hope I've been fair in outlining the key provisions of the ballot initiative. This is an excellent brochure, if you haven't looked at it, but 20-page text to the bill. It's a little tedious to read, so I hope I've been helpful in outlining the key provisions. Ed Bowe.
Sir.
So I'm gonna vote yes. And the reason I'm gonna vote yes is because I grew up in the sixties. And I've already used marijuana and I know what it does. I understand it's a lot stronger now, but what really irritates me is that apparently the government back in the thirties, when Prohibition ended, they had a bunch of G-men that they didn't know what to do with. So they criminalized in the federal level the marijuana so that they would employ the G-men to go out and arrest these people that were using marijuana. And who was using marijuana? People in the music industry, arts, things like that. The average common normal citizen wasn't using marijuana at all. So this whole thing that's going on now irritates me because the whole reason we stopped doing alcohol, which is just as nasty as marijuana, probably worse, was done for the wrong reason. We decriminalized it in the 1930s, and we could have had an experience for the last 50 years, or 60 or 70 years, of knowing what marijuana was going to do to people. Now, I understand it's more potent now than it was back in the 30s, but it was even more potent than it was when I was smoking in the 60s. So I got a yes vote, and I just think that it's going to happen here. It's happened everywhere else. Maricopa's getting a lot of people from California. They're probably a lot of them are tokers, smokers, and I think it's going to pass.
All right, so just as a footnote to that, Ed, earlier this summer, Attorney General Brnovich made a public statement. He said, "I think that the marijuana Prop 207 is going to pass." And the polling showed about 65% of the public supporting the legalization of marijuana. But that's changed over the last few months. So the current polling has less than 50% of Arizonans supporting legalization. I think it's 49% in favor of Prop 207 and 46% opposed. So it's slightly ahead, but it's tightened dramatically. So we really don't know. This is a too close to call kind of thing. But one of the problems with enforcing a law like marijuana, the marijuana prohibition, is that when you think about laws, in order to have a viable criminal justice system, you have to have broad public support. You know, even thieves agree that stealing is wrong. Even a burglar doesn't want to have his own house burglarized. And so there's a broad public consensus that these certain kinds of behavior are illegal and that should be punished. But in the case of marijuana, you've got close to 50%, and in many places more than 50% of the people who don't think marijuana should be against the law. How do you enforce that law? How do you convince people that it's a law that carries moral suasion? You know, you talk to a kid at any high school in this town and tell them about how bad marijuana is, they laugh at you because they know that a lot of people who've used marijuana have gone on to MIT and to Berkeley and to Harvard and Yale. The Ivy League schools are full of pot. So using pot, from their perspective, does not destroy their academic potential and that kind of thing. So we need to think about those things when we just assume that everybody agrees marijuana is a terrible thing and ought to be punished. I'll take one question. I think Steve wants to move on. Go.
You know, one thing that keeps coming up is that it's illegal federally, so these dispensaries, it's a cash business. And, you know, it's hard to track and collect taxes on a cash deal.
You're talking about the black market, right?
Yeah, so just a comment.
No, I think that's a valid comment that just like prohibition back in the 20s, that by making liquor illegal, we created this horrible underground of prohibition and fueled the mafia and all that kind of thing. So in some sense, it probably makes more sense to have things above the table where things can be regulated, things can be taxed. We can make sure that marijuana that's being used in our society doesn't have rat poison in it and things like that. So there is some benefit to it. But again, I'm not going to say, Ed, you and I respectfully disagree. I support the principle of decriminalizing or legalizing marijuana. I think it's a mistake to send people to jail for this and give them criminal records. But this is, in my judgment, not the right way to do it. Go ahead, and then I think they want to.
Quick one. I spoke to law enforcement regarding 207. Just a few weeks ago, I was informed that the additional cost of law enforcement when they pass their initiative is resulted in a negative revenue loss. So do you have any data on that?
I'm not quite sure your point. So you're saying law enforcement people that you have talked to said that because we haven't legalized it yet.
In order to enforce whatever they pass in Colorado resulted in a revenue loss.
The last information I have, and I'm not an authority on what's going on in Colorado, but that there has been tax revenue generated and that they have been able to, it's not a huge amount. It hasn't lived up to projections. I think that's a valid criticism, but I don't think it's increased the cost of law enforcement. How could it, logically, when you think about it? If you legalize something, then you don't have to enforce it. So how can law enforcement make the argument that it's costing us more money to regulate marijuana when it's no longer against the law in Colorado? So I'm dubious of that kind of a statement. But again, I don't know how much money Colorado has raised and how much money they've actually put into their education program. I don't know. I know what the projections are here in Arizona, and they're made by reputable folks. And Kwong, in a few months, you may be forced, you may be forced to vote on this. I think they want to get rid of me now. I think I've used up my time more than enough.
If I could interject a little bit. On the back table, there's some paperwork that outlines the marijuana initiative beyond the human suffering part of marijuana. I'm being biased because I am totally against this initiative. And I could go on as long as you did. Quite honestly, I just had a show yesterday with Sally Sindel with Parents Against Marijuana on Prescott E-News. That will be on next Thursday. And I also have an appointment to interview several people about this initiative. I also have cards from Matt Force back on the table. So, knowledge is power, so please read up. And if you have any questions, and I'm not gonna buy a bunch of time, I'm pretty well versed on this subject, and I'll be glad to meet with anybody because I have personal loss from marijuana use. My son died, okay? His gateway was alcohol and marijuana. It is not the marijuana of the 60s. No. It is way higher, much more concentrated, much more hybrid. I won't keep on going, but please, I made some notes on David. I could go on for a long time with this, guys, but I am absolutely against 207, and I hope Maricopa and Yuma will come around like Yavapai has.
Well, the polling, as I say, is drifting, trending in that direction. It's the voters are not quite as enthusiastic as it at first appeared. And by the way, Glenn, I know Ms. Schindel, and I know the tragedy that she suffered, and I'm glad you had her on. And maybe we should do a podcast.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it very much. Thank you.